Is political violence ever justified? That is the terrible question that we are up against today. It's the second of 3 episodes about what the heck is going on and what to do about it. And I say it's a terrible question, and I mean it. I want to be as serious about this as I know how to be, because, I'm seeing a lot of people, followers of mine, friends of mine, saying, the situation in America has gotten so bad, it's time for secession, it's time for civil war. I'm seeing, that the Biden getting in, that the problem of fraud in the election, all of this stuff is making people feel like they have no way of addressing their political concerns except through violent rebellion. And I want to take that incredibly seriously for 2 reasons. First of all, because I don't just want to shrug it off with this kind of blithe slogan, well, political violence is never justified, and leave it at that. But also because I really do not think that people are thinking this through. I don't think they're taking this seriously enough. When I say that it's a terrible question, I mean what I said last week, which is that when you are asking that question seriously, there has been an abject failure of the government and of the regime. And I said last week that I implicated everybody in it. I do not mean by that everybody is equally culpable. I don't mean like, oh yeah, hashtag both sides, everybody's to blame. I don't mean that at all. You know where I place the blame for this. I place it squarely on our decadent elite who have laughed their way all the way to the bank, while small businesses were scuppered, while people's throats were constricted by a despotic and arbitrary regime ruled by small, petty men. You know how furious I am about that. And I understand why you would react to that and think they've just grasped so much power. They have big tech. Big tech is collaborating. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Google, they're collaborating with the Democrat Party. The CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, is obviously has a vested interest in seeing us fail. They are gleeful whenever things go wrong. They cite it as evidence that capitalism is failing, or that American civil liberties are a farce. Those forms of propaganda are alive and well on Twitter, right? These accounts that tweet things, horrible things about the atrocities in Xinjiang, the Uyghur camps, where basically the Chinese state is allowed to just say, oh, it was, it's great here, everything is fine, while they're forcibly sterilizing people, right? This, I believe me, I feel all of the angst and the anxiety and the fury that would lead people to think that this is such a dire situation that we simply have to take up arms. And as some people have said, that our forefathers would have done it for less, that the infractions of George III were nothing compared to even just coronavirus lockdowns alone, which have led to uncountable numbers of deaths of despair and the unjust seizure of innumerable people's livelihoods. So I do take this seriously. I'm going to pause here and bring you a word from our sponsors. I'm very excited to be sponsored by this new sponsor, ExpressVPN, because a serious part of this whole catastrophe is that, using January 6th as an excuse, big tech has cracked down on conservative voices. And I know that they're making all sorts of excuses for why that's not true. Believe me, it is happening. It is occurring. It's happening to me. People contact me almost every day to tell me that they were unfollowed from me on Twitter against their will. They're doing their best to make it impossible for us to contact one another and to speak to one another. And so I use ExpressVPN because they route my connection through their own encrypted servers, and that essentially scrambles and frustrates the attempts that big tech would otherwise make to keep tabs on me. You can get this right now. You visit expressvpn.com/heretics to get 3 extra months free for a 1-year package. So that's expressvpn.com/heretics to get 3 extra months free. One more time, expressvpn.com/heretics, just like in the title, HERETICS. Okay. I was also appalled by what happened on January 6th. I was taken aback by it. I was sobered by it. And the reason why is because it struck me both as, in itself, a bad thing to do. You do not riot spontaneously. You do not rush into our Capitol building without any form of plan. There was nothing that was going to do except make things worse, and that is the second reason why it's bad, because it did make things worse. It will have our opponents dining out for days. However much I understand the sentiment behind it, however much I can see why people feel at their wits' end right now. I just think that this was a terrible, terrible decision. And I would like to defend that assertion, because I know that people who like me and follow me are feeling differently about this. I would like to defend that by taking seriously the question what political violence is, and what revolution is, and why it is that as a country founded on revolution, we nevertheless are extremely wary of it. Why I feel extremely wary of it, even though, again, as I've said before, I recognize why the failures of our elites have led us to this place where people are feeling this way. So I'm going to discuss basically the history of not just the American Revolution, but of mini revolutions and insurrections within revolutionary America. Because the thing is, guys, we have thought deeply about this in this country. The founders were not dummies, and they were aware of the complexity that comes with founding a country that both lives and dies by the rule of law. Remember, that's what a republic is, right? There's no, divine authority vested in the king to tell you what's right and wrong. There is the law, and we obey the law, and the law is what gives us our freedoms. Our freedoms are granted us by God. They come from God, but they are delivered to us and secured for us by the government. There is only the law that keeps us together as a polity. At the same time, we are founded on the recognition that there come times when things get so bad, and when the government has so fallen down on its job of serving the people, that breaking free of it is the only way. And so I want to take both of those things seriously, and I want to acknowledge that our founders have thought this stuff down to the ground. And it is the first sign of unseriousness to me. These kinds of conversations are not being had. We know that these are questions, and yet when's the last time you heard Federalist 28 mentioned, right, in the public conversations? That's what we're going to do today. We're going to actually take this question seriously and draw on the deep well of resources that we have in this country to think about it. In a moment like this, when we are facing genuine crisis, it's imperative that we know exactly what we're about. And no conversation about this sort of thing would be complete without a recognition of the open hypocrisy of the left about this. Because yes, this is not the first time that this question has arisen. Our cities were ravaged by political violence all throughout the summer of 2020. Our statues were defaced and torn down. Mobs roamed through the streets, terrorizing citizens, and the left laughed. Kamala Harris was inviting donations to bail funds for people who were rioting in the streets. And so, part of the failure of our political class, our elite class, our supposedly elite class, is absolutely that they are not serious about fixing this. If anything, they're serious about throwing kerosene on the fire. All of that having been said, if we are going to be the good guys, we have to think seriously about how to navigate given that. Yes, the left sucks. Yes, there is a terrible kind of hypocrisy and arrogance in our elite classes. That's a fact of the world. How are we going to navigate around that and move forward? That is a question that requires more than doom scrolling on Twitter, right? It is a question that requires reflection and engagement with our deepest writing and principles. As I said before, our country was founded on a revolution. It was founded on a revolution against a monarch who arguably was doing less to oppress the colonists than our own elite is doing to mess with us. However, and I cannot stress this enough, revolutions suck. War sucks. And the big question on the table is, how do we know when the justification for revolution is so immense and so great that it's worth the cost? Because I don't think that people have reckoned with what the cost will be. It is a terrible thing to pit citizen against citizen, brother against brother. We've had a civil war in this country once already. It was one of the most traumatic events in our history. And if you don't start from that place, then you're not thinking about this question in the right way, and you will shoot yourself in the foot, I promise you. So let's jump into thinking about the history of armed rebellion in and around the revolution. So one thing people don't often remember is that within our own formal revolution and just after it, there were a number of kind of like revolutions within revolutions, because the country was not formed yet. It was kind of in embryo, and things were very unstable, and nobody quite knew what the regime was going to look like. And there were all of these problems having in large part to do with the fact that there wasn't a lot of money going around. And so I want to tell you today two of what I've considered the most moving stories from this period, this revolutionary period and founding period in American history. And the first one is about what's called sometimes the Newburgh Conspiracy. And it's called that because it takes place in Newburgh, New York. And it happens really near the end of the Revolutionary War, 1783. And the war ended that year, later after this conspiracy. Victory was in sight, but there was no money. I mean, and this was like a problem throughout. The Continental Congress, which is what was kind of running things at the time, was dithering as Congresses and as representative governments are actually kind of designed to do. They're designed to pit multiple interests against each other and be slow and deliberative. But this is a drastic problem. The army is getting restless, and they rightly feel as if they've given their lives, pledged their lives to the service of this fledgling nation, this highly dangerous project. And they feel really, really shortchanged, especially because war does enrich certain people, certain already kind of wealthy people, and they're seeing others get rich. And it's the beginning of something that, remember when we talked about Machiavelli, I noted that class conflict is kind of central, is inescapable in republics. This is true right from the beginning of ours. There's this resentment of people enriching themselves off the exertions of the army, and the army's not getting money. There begin to emerge in Newburgh, which is where George Washington's army is camped in Newburgh. And there begin to emerge whispers of mutiny. Why should we fight, right? Why should we be risking our lives for these people that don't appreciate us while the aristocrats are getting rich? Why don't we just abscond or try to make our presence felt in some other way? Why don't we just desert or mutiny? Which is obviously a very, very serious threat to not only the revolution, which, remember, they're so close, but also to, of course, the integrity of the rule of law and the legitimacy of what will now be a new regime. It kind of seems as if Alexander Hamilton, who is a younger founding father, it sort of tried to stoke this a little bit. It was sort of conspiratorial, so it's not totally clear what the details of it are exactly, but basically Hamilton was always an advocate for stronger and more energetic government, and he's trying to get the Congress to raise taxes, and he sort of sees this as a lever, as some way to hold them hostage. This problem of not having enough money, not raising enough money, he's saying essentially is gonna get you killed. It's gonna do you in. And so he writes to Washington, kind of insinuating that Washington should let the complaints fester and motivate Congress, right, and get them off their butts. This is not Hamilton's finest moment. It's flirting essentially with Caesarism, right? Because, as I've said before on this show, when a leader has the obedience of the army, which is where the last buck stops in a government, right? Ultimately, laws are enforced with the use of force. The army is supposed to be the sort of instrument of the state. And if the army is instead allied to one guy, to a commander, then that commander is effectively the emperor, right? And that was what happened with Julius Caesar, for all intents and purposes. And if the army is going to use its force for political ends, then we're toast. And that's true. It's just as true now as it was then. It was true when the army was sort of publicly ruminating. There were not the army. There were certain military personnel who were writing pieces about, well, maybe, you know, we might need to escort Trump out of the building. This is bad. This is bad news. And so Washington is in an extremely difficult spot here. He's being offered a temptation, sort of like when Galadriel gets the ring offered to her in Lord of the Rings, right? It's like, you know, this is this huge power, and Galadriel, I think, says, I would use the ring for good, and Washington, I would imagine, would feel this way too, right? He's a virtuous man, he's a good man, and this is this extremely tense moment. He's under all this pressure, and then on the 10th of March 1783, there's this anonymous letter circulated in the army. So I'm going to read this anonymous letter, but first I just want to pause for a moment. This is like a heavy episode, kind of, and I want to state at the outset, as I always do, that I am just really glad that you're here. I'm really glad to be doing this show. It brings me great joy. It brings me especially joy to hear from you, and I hope that you will subscribe, if you haven't already, wherever you get your podcast, Google Play, Stitcher, Apple, and so forth. Don't forget to leave a 5-star review. That also really helps and supports the show and maintain this kind of really urgent, I think, conversation. Okay, back to the show. There's this anonymous letter circulated in the army, written again under no name, so it's just going around. Here's a quotation from it. It says, "After a pursuit of 7 long years, the object for which we set out is at length brought within our reach. Yes, my friends, that suffering courage of yours was active once. It has conducted the United States of America through a doubtful and bloody war. It has placed her in the chair of independency, and peace again returns to bless whom? A country willing to redress your wrongs, cherish your worth, and reward your services, a country courting your return to private life with tears of gratitude and smiles of admiration, longing to divide with you that independency which your gallantry has given and those riches which your wounds have preserved? Is this the case? Or is it rather a country that tramples upon your rights, disdains your cries, and insults your distresses? Have you not, more than once, suggested your wishes and made known your wants to Congress? Wants and wishes which gratitude and policy should have anticipated rather than evaded? And have you not lately, in the meek language of entreating memorial, begged from their justice what you would no longer expect from their favor? How have you been answered? Let the letter which you are called to consider tomorrow make reply." So this is essentially an argument, rather eloquent, it has to be said, a well-penned argument that the country is meeting the army services with ingratitude, and there ought to be a mutiny. They take a couple days to cool off. Washington, in a very intelligent move, meditates for a bit, and then he acts, and he gives a speech, which ought to be read in every school. I'm sure it's not, but this is March 15th, so 5 days after the circulation of the letter. Also 1783, the Newburgh Address, it's called. And here is Washington answering the objections both of the army to Congress, but also some rumors that have been circulating that he himself doesn't have enough of the interests of the army at heart. He's not loyal enough to the army, and maybe they should just rebel on their own. Washington says, "If my conduct heretofore has not evinced to you that I have been a faithful friend to the army, my declaration of it at this time would be equally unavailing and improper. But as I was among the first who embarked in the cause of our common country, as I have never left your side one moment, but when called from you on public duty, as I have been the most constant companion and witness of your distress, and not among the last to feel and acknowledge your merits, as I have ever considered my own military reputation as inseparably connected with that of the army, as my heart has ever expanded with joy when I have heard its praises, and my indignation has arisen when the mouth of detraction has been opened against it, it scarcely can be supposed at this late stage of the war that I am indifferent to its interests." So he's saying you would have to be a blind fool to think that I have anything but the interests of the army at heart. But, he goes on, but how are those interests to be promoted? The way is plain, says the anonymous addresser, says the writer of the letter. If war continues, remove into the unsettled country. There establish yourselves and leave an ungrateful country to defend itself. But who are they to defend? Our wives, our children, our farms, and other property which we leave behind us? Or, in this state of hostile separation, Are we to take the two first, the latter cannot be removed, to perish in a wilderness, with hunger and cold and nakedness? If peace takes place, never sheathe your sword, says he, until you have obtained full and ample justice. This dreadful alternative of either deserting our country in the extremest hour of her distress, or turning our army against it, which is the apparent object, unless Congress can be compelled into an instant compliance, has something so shocking in it that humanity revolts at the idea. My God, what can this writer have in view by recommending such measures? Can he be a friend to the army? Can he be a friend to his country? Rather, is he not an insidious foe, some emissary, perhaps, from New York, plotting the ruin of both by sowing the seeds of discord and separation between the civil and military powers of the continent? And what a compliment does he pay to our understandings when he recommends measures in either alternative impracticable in their nature. Now, I want to note a couple things about this, right? It was only Washington that could have made this speech in this moment. It was only a man who was unimpeachable in his devotion to his country, in his devotion to the army, and to the success and the goodwill and the good nature of his men. It was only he who could have said, you are flirting with a disastrous and, dare I say, evil thing, right? And he says for two reasons. One, you obviously haven't thought it through, right? You're obviously playing with forces that are much larger than you expect and will get yourselves and others killed. Your wives will be at risk, your children will be at risk, and you are unsettling the legitimacy of law and order, which, note how seriously Washington takes this, despite the fact that he is currently fighting in a revolution, right? So that's the first thing to note here. And so when I say, for example, about the rioters on January 6th in the Capitol, which, remember, was a fatal riot, right? So it was not an organized insurrection the way Nancy Pelosi is tearing her hair out about, but it was bad, right? When I say that they were unserious, when I say that they were juvenile, it's not because I don't share some of their concerns about election integrity. Like, I am on record, have written saying that I think this was a very, very mishandled election. I think there was a huge possibility for fraud. They lost those court cases. They just did. They lost them. And Trump, irresponsibly sort of mouthed off about it, giving them this sense that there was something they could do by storming the Capitol. What were they going to do? What plan did they have to remedy this problem, or to restore confidence in election integrity? Is it going to restore confidence in election integrity to storm the Capitol? I mean, so this is what I'm talking about. Right? Washington is saying essentially that you're not thinking clearly here. It's not that I don't recognize your grievances, as I say now, right? Washington is saying, it's not that I don't recognize your grievances, it's that I think that you have been sort of ensnared in a misapprehension about how all of this is going to go down and should go down. And he has one last thing that I want to read about, because one of the things that the anonymous letter had said was that anybody who says, take caution and think, anybody who says, wait a minute and just think about this, that person should be suspected as a traitor. His fidelity is not enough. His faithfulness is not great enough. And that sounds to me a lot like something that some people on the right are currently saying. Well, if you even question Trump for a moment, you're a traitor, right? You're a defector. You're not. Your belief in the cause is not great enough. And for one thing, of course, that's simply not the case. People are merely raising their concerns and their objections out of love for the conservative movement, right? Out of a desire to see this movement succeed. We're saying that this is a problem, and so I want to read what Washington says about that claim, which is one that Thucydides mentions too in the Revolt at Corcyra, that people started to suspect people who counseled caution. People started to suspect them, and Washington says, with respect to the advice given by the author to suspect the man who shall recommend moderate measures and longer forbearance, I spurn it, as every man who regards that liberty and reveres that justice for which we contend undoubtedly must. For if men are to be precluded from offering their sentiments on a matter which may involve the most serious and alarming consequences that can invite the consideration of mankind, reason is of no use to us. The freedom of speech may be taken away, and dumb and silent we may be led like sheep to the slaughter. So he's saying, if you are not able in this moment, when reason and deliberation are exactly what you need, if you can't do that because you're afraid of being considered a traitor, then you've basically undermined the very foundation of everything that we are supposed to be fighting for. So I don't know. Don't do that. Like, don't go around telling people that they're traitors for wanting to think things through. It's not actually. It's not going to have the effects that you want it to have. Just to conclude, here's Washington's conclusion. He says, "Let me conjure you in the name of our common country, as you value your own sacred honor, as you respect the rights of humanity, and as you regard the military and national character of America, to express your utmost horror and detestation of the man who wishes, under any specious pretenses, to overturn the liberties of our country, and who wickedly attempts to open the floodgates of civil discord and deluge our rising empire in blood." By a number of accounts, what happened after this is that Washington put on his glasses to read something aloud, and he said, I apologize. I have nearly gone blind in service of my country." And this is a famous anecdote. And of course, Washington, won the day. He calmed the insurrection, and they won the war. And remember, it was in September of that year that they won. They were so close. And this conspiracy was this sort of big testing point for Washington himself, but also for the country. And so from this we learn that the founders did make a distinction, as must we, between justified, rational rebellion, whose reasons are declared and whose premises and whose objects have been thought through. If you make a distinction between that and anarchy, which is what all other forms of armed insurrection tend toward. You are either tending toward anarchy, or you are thinking carefully through your principles and why you're doing what you're doing. I know that anarchy is the description of what the rioters on the left do, right? I know that the press, the Democrats, are excusing all manner of lawlessness. But this is what separates us from them, not our unwillingness ever to take up arms in the history of ever, right? Because that would be absurd. But what separates us from them is that we are the users of reason, right? And the ones who know upon what principles we proceed. Let us talk about the second episode from our founding history that helps us to think through. Because I'm bookmarking here always, right? That I am going to talk about what a legitimate revolution looks like, so that we can understand what the difference is, right, between riots and revolution. The problem of taxation only got worse. The fact that the central government was basically helpless to levy funds got worse and worse. It was one of the central problems of the Articles of Confederation, which was remember, this was like our sort of, it was Constitution 1.0, yeah. It governed from 1781 to 1789, although it was written earlier than that, 1777. And one of the central problems is that the central government, the federal government, was kind of inadequate to really lead. And they were unable, first and foremost, to levy taxes, which a government really has to be able to do, unpleasant as it is. And so states were the ones basically charged with raising funds, and there were all sorts of problems, among them corruption, but also just scarcity, right? I mean, things, again, this was a hard scrabble bunch. They were much like the early Romans. They were kind of trying to eke out of their farms and out of their personal resources a form of independence that was also economic as well as political. And so I'm going to read now from a book which I recommend. I have a review of this coming out in the Claremont Review of Books. It's called First Principles. It's by Thomas Ricks, who is a man of the left, but has written a really interesting book, actually, it's called What America's Founders Learned from the Greeks and Romans and How That Shaped Our Country. And I just want to read his account of what is called Shays Rebellion, which comes out of this taxation problem, the weakness of the central government, and then the scarcity and the sort of the problems with state taxation. So, Ricks writes, "The farmers of Western Massachusetts were gathering to challenge the post-war distribution of power in the United States. Daniel Shays, the leader of the insurgents, was a veteran who had fought at Lexington, Bunker Hill, and Saratoga. He was, wrote another veteran of Lexington, a man without education, but not without abilities. When he came home from the war, he remained unpaid for his service, and so was unable to pay his debts. Many of his neighbors were in similar straits. By one count, nearly a third of the adult males in Hampshire County in western Massachusetts carried debts they could not repay. So this problem has persisted, essentially, that the government is inadequate to, the form of government is inadequate to raising the funds to pay soldiers for their sacrifice. The insurrection expanded steadily through the summer and fall of 1786. In December, it prevented the holding of courts, stopping seizures of forfeit land, and freezing the collection of debts. The following month, 3 columns of men, one of them led by Shays, marched on the federal arsenal at Springfield, Massachusetts, which held more than 1,000 barrels of gunpowder, as well as thousands of muskets with bayonets. The Confederation government proved unable to respond to the crisis. In October, the Confederation Congress authorized recruiting soldiers to counter the insurgents, but provided no money with which to do so, instead asking the states to provide the funds, which they did not. The government of Massachusetts itself did even worse. When it first mustered units of the militia in the western part of the state, hundreds of its members sided with the insurgents. In response, Governor James Bedoin bypassed his legislature and created a new militia force, funded largely by wealthy Boston merchants. This temporary state force, numbering some 4,000 men, occupied the federal arsenal, where it took possession of some artillery pieces. So this is really things falling apart, right? When you have, basically the insurrection is gaining ground. And the thing is, they have a point, right? Because the government itself is sort of falling to pieces and demonstrating its inadequacy to the moment. The new state militia purposely fired its first cannon shots over the heads of the besieging insurgents, but when the rebels failed to turn back, the militia commander ordered the barrels lowered. A volley of grape shot left 4 men dead and many more wounded. The rebels dispersed, and some of their leaders fled the state. The crisis was over. The entire affair has made the federal government look like an inept bystander. Shays Rebellion would provide the backdrop for the great event of the next 2 years, the convening of a meeting that, exceeding its mandate, would write a new fundamental law for the nation, right? So this is the drafting of the Constitution, which became our Constitution. The founders were both appalled and recognized that something had to change. And so this is a good example. When I say that no one is exempt from the failure that is entailed in riots, I mean that. I mean that, this was a terrible thing and a form of chaos that nobody should have to endure, and yet also the Constitution, the Articles of Confederation was inadequate, and so they have this in their minds. They have the threat, the terror of revolution and insurrection in the back of their minds. And here's what Henry Knox, who would eventually become the first U.S. War Secretary, wrote to George Washington. He said of the rebels, he said, "They see the weakness of government. They feel at once their own poverty compared with the opulent and their own force, and they are determined to make use of the latter in order to remedy the former. Their creed is that the property of the United States has been protected from the confiscations of Britain by the joint exertions of all, and therefore ought to be the common property of all. Our government must be braced, changed, or altered to secure our lives and property. We imagined that the mildness of our government and the virtue of the people were so correspondent that we were not, as other nations, requiring brutal force to support the laws, but we find that we are men, actual men, possessing all the turbulent passions belonging to that animal, and that we must have a government proper and adequate for him." This is kind of a theme, by the way, of this book of First Principles, that as the founding proceeded and as the sort of dust settled from the Revolutionary War, the founders were forced to reckon with the fallenness of man in a new way because they were vesting new power in the people. And they were having to understand that not only the people, but they themselves were flawed. And so he's obviously, Knox is obviously condemning this revolution, this rebellion, rather, Shays Rebellion. But he's also saying, I understand that as our leaders are not, he's saying, I understand that this represents a failure of ours as well. You shouldn't take up arms. You shouldn't, fight against your government if you haven't pursued all other avenues. But at the same time, it's we too are men, he says. That's a really profound and humble insight. And it's that kind of humility is, of course, part of what's lacking from our own leadership class. But they were figuring out essentially that they needed a system that takes all of these problems into account and is realist about the fact of rebellion and the problems of insurrection and the necessity of vesting the government with enough power to at least not be easily toppled and frustrated by a few guys, basically. Because remember that Shays Rebellion, despite having, been incredibly unsettling for everybody, was basically like a bunch of rabble rousers. And they're realizing that you need a rule of law that can stand at least up to something like that. Here is what James Madison, who was instrumental in the drafting of the Constitution, wrote to his father about this whole time. He says, "We learn that great commotions are prevailing in Massachusetts. An appeal to the sword is exceedingly dreaded. The discontented, it is said, are as numerous as the friends of government, and more decided in their measures. Should they get the uppermost, it is uncertain what may be the effect. They profess to aim only at a reform of their constitution and of certain abuses in the public administration, but an abolition of debts, public and private, and a new division of property are strongly suspected to be in contemplation." So Madison's saying, I do not feel that these folks actually know how to deal with power if they get it, and I fear, as everyone does, that sort of mob rule spiraling out of control, as it did in the French Revolution, for example. That once you open that box, a lot of real nasties come out. A major consequence of all of this in the Constitution that is now the law of our land is the ability of our federal Congress to raise taxes. Our national legislature can raise taxes and use them for a standing army. This is Article 1, Section 8, Clause 12 of the Constitution. The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debt and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States, and then in order to raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to that use shall be for a longer term than 2 years. If you remember back in summer 2020 when the riots were tearing through the streets, Tom Cotton, the senator, wrote a now infamous op-ed in the New York Times called "Send in the Troops." And I think it's now been revised to say "Send in the military" or something, because there was an enormous blow-up about this at the Times. But Cotton was making the argument that this is basically why, or one of the reasons why, Congress was vested with the power of raising funds for an army, is to put down insurrections of the kind that he saw tearing through the streets. And so essentially, this is a moment when the founders are reckoning with the fact that actually their rebellions are likely to be afoot from time to time. And I think conservatives, who are now obviously sort of flirting with this form of armed insurrection, conservatives at the time were very much in support of Cotton, because he was arguing something that's obviously right, that this is what the military in part exists to do, in addition to fighting wars overseas. James Wilson wrote rather cogently about this in the ratifying convention for Pennsylvania, and he's another sort of underappreciated founding father. But he says it may frequently be necessary to keep up standing armies in time of peace. The present Congress have experienced the necessity, and 700 troops are just as much a standing army as 70,000. The principle which sustains them is precisely the same. They may go further and raise an army without communicating to the public the purpose for which it is raised. On a particular occasion, they did this. When the commotions existed in Massachusetts, so he's talking about Shays Rebellion, right? They gave orders for enlisting an additional body of 2,000 men. I believe it is not generally known on what perilous tenure we held our freedom and independence at that period. The flames of internal insurrection were ready to burst out in every quarter. They were formed by the correspondents of state affairs, to whom an allusion was made on a former day, and from one end to the other of the continent, we walked on ashes, concealing a fire beneath our feet. That sounds mighty familiar, I gotta say. This sense, I compare it to a powder keg all the time, this sense that really our elites are playing with fire, and our people are playing into their hand in many cases by letting this stuff, this terrible abuse of power, drive us crazy and do stupid things. And I think that is honestly a big part of the riots on the left, as well as the riot on the right, And so essentially, the founders were saying, well, there has to be some way to prevent against this just bursting out at any time. Remember what I talked about, like if this is something you can do anytime you feel discontent, then you are creating anarchy. And Wilson is basically saying that was what we flirted with. We were up against anarchy, because if these people had been able to just basically make their case by force of arms, then anybody can make their case by force of arms. And so the government, our federal government, is now vested with power to put these kinds of insurrections down. In Federalist 28, which I mentioned at the beginning, is kind of the Federalist paper to read about this. Remember, these are the essays that John Jay and mostly Alexander Hamilton and James Madison are writing to defend the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 28, this is in 1787, he's defending this idea of standing armies supported by congressional funds. And he says something that I find very strangely comforting, since I've now just said to you that I think this is such a dire circumstance when you have sustained rioting, especially in the capital, right? Hamilton says, there may happen cases in which the national government may be necessitated to resort to force cannot be denied. Our own experience has corroborated the lessons taught by the examples of other nations, that emergencies of this sort will sometimes arise in all societies, however constituted, that seditions and insurrections are, unhappily, maladies as inseparable from the body politic as tumors and eruptions from the natural body, that the idea of governing at all times by the simple force of law, which we have been told is the only admissible principle of republican government, has no place but in the reveries of those political doctors whose sagacity disdains the admonitions of experimental instruction. He's saying, be practical, and this is that strain of realism that I'm talking about, where he's saying people are people, right? And you're actually, the theory of republican government, which I just articulated earlier, is, that law is what rules. But he's saying you need to be able to enforce that because people are flawed and broken. Should such emergencies, he writes, at any time happen under the national government, there could be no remedy but force. Okay, having said all of this, I'm now going to say, but what about, right, our Declaration of Independence, which it's not that much remarked upon, but our Declaration of Independence begins when, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. Not if, right, but when. It is taken as a given in our founding documents that revolution and separation, secession, right, are things that are justified sometimes. How could it not be? Because they were doing it as they spoke, right? And so, as I said, Hamilton was no slouch, and he considered this. He considered what would happen if, as he puts it, if the representatives of the people betray their constituents, then there is no resource left but in the exertion of that original right of self-defense, which is paramount to all positive forms of government, and which against the usurpation of the national rulers may be exerted with infinitely better prospect of success than against those of the rulers of an individual state. So now we're getting into Hamilton's genuinely quite original and remarkable argument for why a federal army will actually help to legitimate whatever rebellions may occur. He's basically saying, if you have to fight against the federal army, then you have to defend, legitimize, and organize your plan. You have to, before a wide array of American citizens, before many, many people, convince them that their rights have been usurped and that they need to, because otherwise you're going to fail, because the central, he knew that the federal government would become powerful and that you'd have to really be serious and take it seriously if you were going to think about overthrowing it. Because in a single state, if the persons entrusted with supreme power become usurpers, the different parcels, subdivisions, or districts of which it consists, having no distinct government in each, can take no regular measures for defense. The citizens must rush tumultuously to arms, without concert, without system, without resource, except in their courage and despair. The usurpers, clothed with the forms of legal authority, can too often crush the opposition in embryo. So I think this is, in some ways, this is the fear that we are all, those of us who are sort of worried about the sort of soft coup of the government being overthrown, right? This is the fear that we have, that the government will become so powerful that no rebellion will be enough to overthrow it. The thing is, right, that Hamilton is basically saying the federal government exists to make that real, to basically require anybody that really thinks he's got a claim to revolution, to require that person to get serious and get his or her acts together. And he even goes so far as to say that you'd actually probably have to ally with the state governments against the federal government. He says the great extent of the country is a further security. We have already experienced its utility against the attacks of a foreign power, and it would have precisely the same effect against the enterprises of ambitious rulers in the national councils. If the federal army should be able to quell the resistance of one state, the distant states would have it in their power to make head with fresh forces. The advantages obtained in one place must be abandoned to subdue the opposition in others. And the moment the part which had been reduced to submission was left to itself, its efforts would be renewed and its resistance revive. This finally is the key, right? This is what I am trying to basically argue, is that neither the rioters on January 6th nor the rioters, the thugs who tore through our streets in summer of 2020 look like what Hamilton is describing here. And the reason is that there has not been a cogent case for revolution made to a big enough percentage of the people and of the potentially rebellious states. And that is because we have not reached the point of revolution. If we had, we would be able to gather this kind of coalition. We are not, because, in fact, we haven't even begun to fight back in the way that we're going to have to, which is peaceably and lawfully. And I know that people are going to say, well, but they've taken over big tech, they've silenced our voices, they're making deals with the CCP. How are we ever going to get together? Have you tried? I don't know that the people who are saying this have tried. Here are some questions. Do you know what the politics of your neighbor are? Do you know your neighbor's name? Have you talked to your neighbor about your local government? Do you know the name of your local representative, right? The left has been playing that ground game for decades, and that is how they won. I know that they have used riots as a tool unscrupulously as part of their ascendancy to power, but that is not how they took control of the country. They took control of the country by insinuating themselves into our cultural institutions. And remember that they were pariahs back then. Think about how a communist sympathizer or a sexual deviant would have been regarded in the 1950s or even as late as the 1960s by the majority of the country. That sort of stuff was considered completely outside the Overton window, utterly beyond the pale, in the exact same way that conservatives are now worried we're going to become. Right? What did they do? They congregated among the radicals in the academies. They fomented rebellion. They shifted the Overton window step by slow step. And believe me, nobody is more angry about this and upset about this than I am, right? They took over the country by soft degrees, by persuading people of their crappy ideas. And we joke that they sort of idolize people like Stacey Abrams, this failed gubernatorial candidate in Georgia. But they know, the left knows, that Stacey Abrams' ground game helped win them the Senate, right? And when it all comes down to that sort of thing, these slow, localist, daily practices, which the right doesn't engage in, right? They are successful. So even if, and I don't actually believe that it's going to be this extreme, but even if we become pariahs on the outskirts of society, even if we are at the farthest reaches of our sort of the Overton window, essentially, have we tried? Have we really tried to infiltrate the academies, to take back the academies for our good ideas instead of their psychotic ones? Have we really tried all of the routes that they used to gain political and cultural power in this country? I don't think that we have. And I think until we have and failed, and really found that there are structural obstacles to our success at that ground game, which is effectively what the left has been so good at. Until we find that there are structural, insurmountable obstacles that make it impossible for us to make our political will known, we will not be able to make the nationwide case that Hamilton rightly says is the case you have to be able to make in order to test the legitimacy and the seriousness of your revolutionary aims. We are far from there, my friends. I really believe that we are, and I think that this was a misbegotten venture, and that another way lies ahead of us, which will still be grinding and slow and hard, and will require all of our efforts and energies. And it sucks. I hate it. I don't like that these insane gender theorists and commies are in control of the White House and the Senate any more than you do. I hate big tech. I obviously, as you know, I'm working to get on any possible platform I can that is not Twitter or Facebook, right? But that's the kind of thing that we really have to do. We have not been serious about building that infrastructure. It is time to get serious about it, and I believe that our founders have shown us the way and guided us into that path with the careful thought that they did about this way back in the day. We are a long way off, thank God, from having to stage a revolution. So grow up and let's get to work. This has been really fun to talk about with you. I hope that it has been at least somewhat persuasive. And I hope that you're on board with me in the project of day by day gradually taking back the culture and the country. The mailbag. Mailbag questions, having just indicted big tech, mailbag questions do still sometimes come to me on Twitter, but don't forget that if you are trying to break the power of big tech over us to speak, one big thing that you can do is you can seek me out on the platforms that are not as popular. I'm on minds.com, minds.com/Spencer Klavan, and you can ask me questions there. You can ask me questions on Parler, insofar as it's available under the depredations of the tech state. But let's answer a mailbag question from Twitter at the moment. I want to answer a mailbag question from Joe Treadway, JC Tread. Prophetic question. Besides the Hagia Sophia, has the invasion of Russia into Istanbul already taken place, or is there more to occur? I would like to answer this question by cautioning against reading the tea leaves in this way. And it's not because I don't think that God communicates to us through the course of human events. And it's not that I think the prophecies in Revelation or the prophecies that Jesus makes about the fall of the temple and the standing of the desecration in the holy place. It's not that I think those are anything other than true, right? They are true. I don't believe that they are there so that we can try and figure out what's going to happen next. If anything, they are there so that we can look back on what did happen and realize that Jesus was right, that he told us the truth. And I have had experiences in my own life where I felt that I was getting some sort of intuition that something was going to happen. And then I looked back on it and it was true. And that confirmed my sort of sense that there is a divine presence and it communicates with humanity. Jesus is very explicit that we do not know the day and the hour of the second coming, which entails in itself the apocalypse and the end of the world and the coming of the kingdom from the New Jerusalem from heaven to earth. I do not think that that calculating what has and hasn't happened yet in the prophecies is a good metric for thinking about what you ought to do. And this is going to be, as I now transition into talking about localism and local government, which is going to be sort of my next episode, my third and final episode. I'm gonna suggest that we reorient, myself included. I'm talking to myself as much as to anybody. I'm going to suggest that we reorient our minds and our attitudes toward our immediate surroundings. Not because we shouldn't be thinking about federal and national politics, not because it's not fun to speculate on the prophecies and the grand apocalyptic visions in the Bible, but because I genuinely think that we have a neurosis in this country and in the conservative movement that connects us emotionally more to these big abstract movements and principles that are happening out there than to our immediate lives. I get messages all the time from people who are despairing, and then I say, "How's your personal life going?" And it's going great, right? And I do this too. I despair. I find myself thinking everything's going to go terribly, terribly wrong. The end of the world is here. And then I wake up and I sort of look around and I'm like, "Oh, this is great. I'm having a great time." And I know that bad stuff does happen, but deal with the bad stuff that's happening in your life. And I'm going to talk next week about how that can be a key, actually, to what we actually need to do instead of mount a revolution. But in any case, thanks again. Thanks for the question. I don't mean to dismiss it. I just want to tell you my philosophy of those kinds of questions, because it's similar to others that I've gotten before. It has been a pleasure, as always, to be with you. Thank you for joining us. It's so great to do this show. And if I rant on it, if I speak out of reprimand, it's because I believe so seriously in what we together are doing. And I wish to speak the truth to you in as forceful a way as possible so that we can succeed. And I'm grateful to you for being here with me. If you like this work, and especially if you liked this episode, you should really think about checking out the Claremont Review of Books and the American Mind, which is both of which are part of the Claremont Institute where I work. And you can donate to us at claremont.org/donate. donate and let us know that you heard about Claremont through Young Heretics. And thanks again. We will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.